The old man stood at the checkout counter, patting his empty pockets while strangers rolled their eyes and checked their watches. "You've been here twice today already, sir," the cashier said with barely contained frustration. The woman behind him muttered something about wasting everyone's time. That's when two young men in civilian clothes stepped out from aisle 6, saw the faded patch on his jacket, and immediately snapped to attention. His name was Walter Eugene Brooks, and at 78, he moved through the world like a man walking underwater. Each step was deliberate, calculated around the limitations of arthritic joints and a left knee that had carried shrapnel for 60 years. His aluminum cane bore the scratches and dents of daily use, the rubber tip worn smooth from countless trips across linoleum floors and cracked sidewalks. Walter dressed the same way every day: pressed khaki slacks that hung loose on his shrinking frame, a blue flannel shirt tucked in with military precision, and brown leather shoes that he still polished every Sunday morning out of habit. His glasses sat perpetually crooked on his nose, and more often than not, his socks didn't match. Not because he couldn't see the difference, but because some mornings, the simple act of matching colors felt like solving calculus. He lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment 3 blocks from the Piggly Wiggly, in a complex that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and other people's cooking. The walls were bare except for a single-frame photograph of 22 young men in fatigues, their faces serious and impossibly young. Walter was in the back row, third from the left, though most people wouldn't recognize him now. Every Tuesday and Friday, he walked to the grocery store, sometimes for eggs, sometimes for bread, sometimes for reasons he couldn't quite remember by the time he arrived. The walk itself was the point, a mission that got him out of the apartment and moving, even when moving hurt. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, Walter had made the trip twice already. The first time, he'd wandered the aisles for 20 minutes before leaving with a carton of milk he didn't need. The second time, he'd picked up cat food, though he'd never owned a cat in his life. Now on his third visit, he stood at the register with a dozen eggs and a loaf of white bread, reaching for a wallet that wasn't there. The patch on his jacket was barely visible, a small, faded insignia sewn above the left breast pocket. Most people would walk past it without a second glance. The colors had long since bled together, and the edges were frayed from decades of wear. But to those who knew what to look for, it told a story. The combat infantry badge, the mark of a soldier who had closed with the enemy and lived to tell about it. Inside the wallet he'd forgotten at home, tucked behind his driver's license and Medicare card, was a photograph so worn the edges had turned to felt. A young man in jungle fatigues knelt beside a muddy foxhole, his M16 rifle across his knees. His face was serious, aged beyond his 19 years, with eyes that had seen too much. The photograph had been taken in the central highlands of Vietnam, near a place called Landing Zone X-Ray. The date on the back, written in fading blue ink, read November 16th, 1965. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is the third time today," the cashier said, her voice carrying the particular brand of exhaustion that comes from dealing with difficult customers during a double shift. "Maybe you should call someone to help you shop." The woman in line behind Walter shifted impatiently from foot to foot. "This is ridiculous," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some people shouldn't be allowed out alone." A man further back in line chuckled, probably trying to scam free groceries. "My grandmother tried the same thing before we put her in a home." Walter's hands began to shake, not from embarrassment, though that was there too, but from something deeper, a familiar tightness in his chest that reminded him of incoming mortars and the sound of helicopters that never seemed to arrive fast enough. He gripped his cane tighter and tried to remember where he'd put his wallet, or why he'd come to the store, or sometimes, on the worst days, where he was entirely. "Sir?" The manager appeared at the cashier's shoulder, radio clipped to her belt and authority in her voice. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. You're holding up the line. That's when Staff Sergeant Miguel Alvarez looked up from the magazine rack where he'd been browsing with his buddy Jake Morrison. Both men were on leave from Fort Benning, still adjusting to civilian clothes after 9 months in Afghanistan. But some things you never really take off, even when you're wearing jeans and sneakers instead of ACUS and combat boots. Miguel saw the patch first, faded and almost invisible, but unmistakable if you knew military insignia, the Combat Infantry Badge. Then he noticed the man wearing it, elderly, confused, being publicly humiliated while a crowd of civilians stood by and watched. "Excuse me," Miguel said, stepping forward with Jake close behind. His voice carried the particular authority that comes from leading soldiers under fire. "Is there a problem here?" The manager turned, ready to dismiss another young troublemaker, but stopped when she saw Miguel's posture. Straight back, chin up, hands clasped behind him in a modified parade rest. Jake had unconsciously fallen into the same stance. "This gentleman seems to have forgotten his wallet," the manager said, her tone softening slightly. "We've tried to be patient, but—" "May I?" Miguel interrupted, reaching slowly into his back pocket. He withdrew a worn leather bifold and flipped it open to reveal his military ID. Staff Sergeant Miguel Alvarez, 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. A hush fell over the small crowd that had gathered. Miguel turned to face them, his voice carrying clearly through the fluorescent-lit store. "That patch on this gentleman's jacket, that's a Combat Infantry Badge. Do you know what that means?" He paused, looking at each face in turn. "It means he closed with and destroyed the enemy in ground combat. It means he put his life on the line for his country. It means while you were sleeping safe in your beds, he was carrying a rifle through places that would give you nightmares." Jake stepped forward and placed a crisp $20 bill on the counter. "For his groceries," he said quietly, "and for his dignity, which shouldn't have a price tag." The store fell completely silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of a shopping cart somewhere in the produce section. The woman who had complained about waiting shuffled backward, suddenly fascinated by her shoes. The man who had made the comment about scamming groceries quietly slipped away toward the exit. Walter looked up for the first time since the ordeal began. His eyes were wet, but his back was a little straighter. "Where did you serve, sir?" Miguel asked gently. Walter's voice was barely above a whisper. "1st Cavalry Division, Ia Drang Valley, November 65. Jake's eyes widened. His own grandfather had served in Vietnam, though he'd never talked about it much. But Jake knew enough military history to understand what those words meant. The Ia Drang Valley was where the U.S. Army first met the North Vietnamese Army in conventional battle. It was where young Americans learned that this war would be unlike anything they'd trained for. "My grandfather was there too," Jake said softly. "1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry." Walter nodded slowly. "Gary Owen," he said, referring to the 7th Cavalry's traditional battle cry. "We were the ones who landed first. LZX-ray. They were waiting for us." Miguel didn't need to know the details to understand the weight of those words. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of older NCOs who'd been through Mogadishu, or Iraq, or any of the dozen other places where American soldiers had learned that the enemy doesn't always fight by the same rules. "Thank you for your service, sir," Miguel said, and he meant it. Not the perfunctory phrase that people say because they think they should, but the genuine gratitude of one warrior to another. The cashier rang up Walter's eggs and bread without another word. Her earlier impatience had been replaced by something that might have been shame, or perhaps just a newfound understanding that not every confusion is laziness, not every mistake is malice. The manager disappeared back to her office. The other customers in line suddenly found urgent business elsewhere in the store, and Walter Brooks, who had walked into the Piggly Wiggly as just another confused old man, stood a little taller as he accepted his bag of groceries. "Thank you," he said to the two young soldiers. though the words seemed inadequate for what had just happened. "Welcome home, sir," Miguel replied, using the phrase that Vietnam veterans had waited decades to hear from their fellow Americans. Walter nodded once, adjusted his grip on his cane, and walked slowly toward the automatic doors. But for just a moment, in the fluorescent lit checkout lane of a small-town grocery store, he wasn't a 78-year-old man struggling with memory loss. He was a 19-year-old paratrooper who had answered his country's call and lived to tell about it. Miguel and Jake watched him go, then quietly returned to their shopping. They didn't want thanks or recognition. They'd simply done what their own training and honor demanded, looked after a fellow soldier who had carried the load long before they were even born. Outside, Walter paused at his old Buick and fumbled for keys that were, thankfully, still in his pocket. He set the grocery bag on the passenger seat next to the wallet he'd forgotten to bring inside, then sat for a moment in the driver's seat. Through the store window, he could see Miguel and Jake moving through the aisles, probably picking up the kind of junk food that young soldiers always seem to live on. They looked impossibly young to his eyes, though he knew they had already seen things that would age them beyond their years. The Army had a way of doing that, taking boys and turning them into men faster than nature ever intended. He started the engine and pulled slowly out of the parking lot, past the strip mall and the gas station, and the dozen other anonymous landmarks of small-town America. Tomorrow he would probably forget their names, might even forget this entire encounter. But somewhere deep in the part of his mind where the important things lived, the things that survived decades and disease and the slow erosion of time, he would remember that two young soldiers had seen him, really seen him, had recognized not the confused old man he'd become, but the soldier he had always been. And that, Walter thought as he drove home through the lengthening shadows of Tuesday afternoon, was worth more than all the wallets in the world. They're in the checkout line behind you, sitting alone at the diner counter, walking slowly through the park at dawn. The hands that once held rifles now tremble with age. The eyes that once scanned for enemies now struggle to remember where they parked. But the heart that served with honor, that never fades. Their stories live in the spaces between what we see and what we choose to ignore. Subscribe to Echo Bravo, because every weathered face has carried burdens we can't imagine, and every forgotten hero deserves to be remembered before it's too late.